Hello, my name is Victoria and I'm a professional watercolor artist, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about the pigment to water ratio that you use in watercolor. So a few things. This is a scrap piece of paper. It was a small cutting and then obviously it got a little messed up, and also it has the little embellishment of arches on it, so I probably wasn't going to use it anyway. But this is Arches paper. This is nice paper. I did do a paper comparing video on my channel. It was just about comparing the different supplies. So you can go watch that if you'd like to. But even though this is like nothing I would use in a painting, it is nice paper. It's a piece of scrap and we can always just flip it over if it was messed up. Same goes for if you have any paintings that you don't like so much or whatever. Don't throw them away. Turn them around. You can paint on the back side of the paper. And it's really good to have scrap paper. So, with watercolor, the more water that you have, so I'm just going to put down a little wash here, to a very tiny amount of pigment, the lighter it's going to be. This is alizarin crimson. This is a very light wash, and as a rule of thumb, watercolor dries 10% lighter than it looks when it's wet. So as we let this dry, you will see it will become lighter. I barely touched the paint in my palette to do that. And I want to make a point of this alizarin crimson. It is wet now because I did touch it. It is dry. All of my paints in my palette are dry. This is how I prefer to paint. But as a little experiment, I did wet a different well with some alizarin crimson in it, and I'm letting the water sit. And this is extremely watery to where I wouldn't even need to put down water first. This was just letting this sit, and I will bring that palette over here. I've got a lot of palettes going on, but that's some more alizarin crimson, and I put, a bunch of water in here. This is very, very pigmented and very washy. I prefer, when I'm painting, sorry about the clatter, I prefer when I'm painting to use it from dry because I control how much pigment I get on my brush. So say I wanted to match this intensity, let's scooch this over, from my dry alizarin crimson, I would bring a bunch of water on my brush and really give this a good scrub. So that's like basically the same thing, and this will dry up a lot faster than that whole well of paint. It will evaporate. You're not hurting your colors when you throw a lot of water in them, but the only time I paint like that I paint where it is wet in the well, is when I'm doing huge areas of washes. And I mean like big. So maybe 10% of the time I will paint like that. But I can just as easily give a good back and forth with my brush in my palette to get that same intensity. Let's check on this. This is pretty light, and it's hard to believe that this is all from one color. But when we have less pigment and more water, that's when it looks light. A good way to play with this is by doing value scales. I'm going to do a little value scale down here. Let me actually dig. Sorry, one second. I contaminated my alizarin crimson there. Okay, much better. So a value scale. I'm going to get as dark as I can on the left-hand side with alizarin crimson. And again, I'm doing this from the palette that is pretty dry. It's not the very washy one. And I can dig and dig and dig and come back. And so to me, that's about as dark as alizarin crimson is ever going to get without me adding black to it. It's not the tidiest value scale, but you are definitely going to see. So at this point, it's just less pigment. And it's kind of been the same wash for a little bit, so I'm just going to add a little bit of water. And there's no harm in going back on the areas. It just stayed the same value for quite a bit. So let me just mess with this for one more second. There we go. But all the way over here it is very light, and I could keep going and keep dragging this out until I hit just complete clear water. So this is all of the range that alizarin crimson has to offer us. I did make this a little bit bigger than intended, but that's fine. This is just a scrap piece of paper. This is as dark as it's ever going to get without us adding black. And I do have another video about how to make your own black on my channel. So yeah, this is as dark as this is ever going to get. This is extremely opaque. Barely any of the paper from underneath is showing, but as we move over, we can see that it's definitely more and more paper showing. So you get quite the range. Also, if you remember, this is the color that I used the very watery alizarin crimson with, and this is still quite the wet mess. So I find that this technique of going in with your paints dry makes things dry faster because there's not as much water to play around with. But again, in big areas, it is helpful to do it the other way. So that is my personal preference. That is how I like to paint. And everyone can have their own preferences. And so you're going to want to, when you get new colors, make little value scales. Now again, much smaller than I made with this alizarin crimson one. Let me just reach up here. And show my value scale. Now I do this with every single color that I have. I label them. And I go from a darker wash on the left side, and I do make it lighter. Now obviously it's not as light as it can go, but this is just a nice little technique. And in fact, when paint companies send, their paints in stores, they come at the bottom with a little value scale. So I'm going to show you what I have from some Daniel Smith paint, because I ordered one of their dot cards. And so on here we can see a whole bunch of different value scales, and it gives us a look at what these colors have as a range. And if you're wondering what a dot card is, this is a dot card. A lot of brands make them. I know Winsor Newton makes them. I got this from Daniel Smith because I was interested in trying out these shiny colors. And you just get to sample the paint. It's a little bit. You can see there's a few that I've used quite a bit of. And it's a nice way to try a bunch of colors without investing a whole lot of money into them. So I'm just going to scoot my alizarin crimson back up. Again, this middle one is still really wet, and this one is almost dry. You can just see a tiny little sheen of it. So try both ways. try putting a lot of water in your paints that you're using. Try painting from dry. See what works for you, because what works for me might be a little different than what works for you. And maybe you want to have a palette that you get completely wet and then one that you paint from that's dry. You know, there's all sorts of ways to do this, but that is how I paint. And once again, with the pigment to water ratio here, that's what this value scale, you know, symbolizes. But it's really nice practice to maybe dig in your palette. Let's give it 2 little swipes and see how much paint we get there. And maybe we do a bunch of them. And ooh, that's already darker. Now again, my brush is wet because I do have to activate the paint. But maybe we go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and really build it up on our brush. And that's even just a little bit darker than that one. And then maybe we barely touch it and see how that actually did get a lot up. And I'll tell you why it got a lot up, because this is wet. So there was already water there to come up on the brush. It had pigment in it. So that's why just one little swipe while that's wet gave us that result. If I were to go at it completely dry, it would not be that at all. It would be more so this. So your water to pigment ratio does matter. Play around with it. Get a piece of scrap paper. See how you feel. And if you have any questions, let me know.